Race war in high school. The 10-year destruction of Franklin K. Lane High School in Brooklyn. Harold Saltzman. Chapter 5. A student riot and a mayoral election.
The big brown Oldsmobile sedan turned right off 3rd Avenue and headed east on 88th Street toward Gracie Mansion. For Albert-Shanker and the other UFT officials it was a familiar scene. The newsmen were waiting as the Union president crossed East End Avenue and steered his car past the iron gates that shielded the mayor from the everyday bizarre happenings of the city. What had brought the officialdom of the nation's largest local union to the mayor's residence at 6 p.m. on a Friday evening, just 84 hours before the people of New York were scheduled to go to the polls to choose their next mayor? Gracie Mansion was a place that stirred only the bitterest of memories for the UFT leaders, and on the 4-mile drive uptown from the Union's 21st Street headquarters, returning to the scene where they had suffered some of their most heartbreaking defeats, this was a recurring thought for them. Gracie Mansion, a large white neo-colonial structure situated on several sprawling acres of scenic real estate overlooking Manhattan's East River, was the home the people of the great metropolis provided for their mayor. For the UFT leaders it had a very special meaning. It was here that they were outwitted and outmaneuvered during the teacher strikes of 1967 and 1968. In that first year it was John Lindsay, siding with school board president Alfred Giardino and superintendent Bernard Donovan, who helped prolong a 14-day strike that set the tone for the ultimate disaster the following year. It was that triumvirate which converted the union's legitimate program for dealing with emotionally disturbed youngsters into the false public impression that the UFT wanted to force black youngsters out of the public schools. For the first time, the alliance the union had welded with the civil rights, liberal, and minority groups of the city was split asunder. The union's demand for expansion of its more effective schools program of specialized and concentrated educational services for ghetto schools went almost unnoticed in 1967. And by the time the 3-week stoppage ended on September 29, John Lindsay had emerged as a shining knight. His own image was untarnished, and to many he was the hero of the hour, the man who had stood off that big, bad powerful union of opportunistic and selfish teachers. The UFT had for the first time in its history tasted bitter defeat, and in spite of Shanker's victory claimed the teachers and their now badly divided leadership knew that something dreadful had happened. The mayor and the school board had cleverly pitted them against the parents and liberal sectors of the body politic, their traditional and natural allies. Who could have envisioned black parents counter-picketing in front of neighborhood schools, those same parents who had walked on UFT picket lines in battles past? And after 14 days of struggle, settlements that were somehow never finalized, came the end product, a contract containing a watered-down and meaningless disruptive child provision which was impossible to administer, no expansion of the top priority more effective schools program, little plugging of gaping loopholes in working conditions carried over from the 1965 agreement, and salary gains that were meager in terms of the union's objectives and the galloping inflation. 50,000 teachers had participated in the strike, but their unity began to show cracks on 3 different occasions when union members filtered back, crossing their own picket lines as rumors of pending settlements flew about. Gracie Mansion was an old story to Albert-Shanker and the other union officers. Again in 1968 the mayor had humbled the UFT, forcing it to stay on strike for 36 days this time, and helping to create a racial polarization over the firings in the Ocean Hill School District that nearly destroyed the town. Through ineptitude, and out of a perverted bias against unionism, the mayor set race against race and painted the UFT with an anti-black smear from which it would not soon recover. And in 1968, too, the mansion was the scene of the hottest conflict as the mayor played off the Ocean Hill crowd against Albert-Shanker and the teachers' union. But it was all very different a year later. On the evening of October 31, 1969, just 4 days before the polls would open to determine whether or not he would continue in office for another 4-year term, the mayor of the city of New York felt free to call upon his old enemy, Albert-Shanker, in a moment of need. It didn't matter that the Daily News straw poll that morning had shown him way ahead with 47% of the vote, his closest opponent, Mario Procasino, well behind with 29%, and Republican John Marchi a distant third with only 20%. The mayor was on the verge of achieving a political miracle. Through a carefully planned campaign he had swung enough of the UFT-connected constituency, the Jewish middle class, to snatch victory from almost certain defeat and keep alive his hopes of entering presidential politics in 1972. But on the afternoon of October 31st what the mayor dreaded most had happened, and it happened at Franklin K. Lane High School. If there was a single issue that could upset the delicate plurality John Lindsay had fashioned, it surely was the race question, especially as it was related to the schools. In a well-balanced campaign he had promised the voters safety in the streets and in the schools, pledging that the schools would not again be turned into battlegrounds by unrepresentative minorities of minorities. But the racial violence that erupted at Lane that day could have easily destroyed in the minds of wary voters the notion that John Lindsay had learned from his mistakes and wouldn't again turn the town and its schools over to black extremists. The mayor had become closely identified with Lane after the Syracuse burning in January. When trouble broke out there again in October, he made one pronouncement after another about his refusal to tolerate disruption that interfered with daily instruction. After the burning he had sent in his own personal representative, J. David Love, to participate in the negotiations at the school and head off a pending job action by the faculty. Later, it was Lindsay's school task force aide, Richard Strider, who came to the rescue, cutting the red tape and getting the fire and buildings departments to approve in days the Arlington church site to be utilized as a Lane annex for the returning truants. And when school opened in September, Louis Feldstein, Lindsay's school task force director, was a frequent visitor at Lane, making it quite clear that the school was still a major concern to City Hall. Mario Procaccino, the Democratic candidate, was desperate in the closing days of a badly run, disorganized, and highly disappointing campaign. 5 months earlier it seemed impossible for the comptroller to lose. But here, 4 days before the election, he found himself 18 percentage points behind the mayor in the city's most reputable poll. He had run a straight law and order campaign, and was quick to jump on the riot that broke out at Lane that afternoon. It might be his last chance to hit the mayor where he was most vulnerable, the issue of racial violence in the schools. If the comptroller had planted his own agents in Lane they couldn't have done a better job of providing him with ammunition to fire at the mayor. The fall semester at Lane had been an instant replay of the one just passed. The term had opened quietly at Lane, and in schools throughout the city there was a note of optimism. During the first month of the semester there was little of the tension which had become an everyday thing in the Cypress Hills school during the previous school year. Students walked through the halls smiling, talking about all the good things that were happening, the moon landing, the champion New York Mets, and there were definite signals that the wounds of last year were beginning to heal. This was a brand new school year, and wasn't high school supposed to be a happy, a rewarding life experience, the place you met your first love, the time when you went to parties, dances, athletic events, and the prom? It could all be so wonderful, if only. There were signs that fall that the worst was over. Student cutting was down, there was less lateness than usual, there had been no confrontations between students and teachers, and none of that racial antagonism was evident in the places where large numbers of students congregated. The police were still in the building, but they had blended in with the scenery and were hardly noticed by most students. And there were only 35 new teachers added to the staff, half the number that had come in for previous fall semesters. For a school where staff turnover was a serious problem, the possibility of stabilizing the faculty was promising. Yes, the prospects for a good school year at Lane were more encouraging in September, 1969, than they had been for some time. Steps had even been taken to meet demands presented by the militants. The crisis of the fall semester, paradoxically, had roots in the demand to add courses in Black studies to the curriculum. These course offerings were introduced in the fall term and the militants were given the first opportunity to enroll in them. An abundance of material was made available by the Social Studies Department, and to answer the demand for Black instructors, Ronald King, a Black health education teacher, was given the job of teaching one of the courses in African Studies. King had been a member of the faculty since 1962. He became a part-time guidance counselor in 1966 and in 1968 served as one of the 2 faculty advisors to the school's African Culture Association. In June 1969, also in response to the militants' demand for black administrators, a new post was created especially for him, that of assistant to the assistant principal Mary Cohen. King, a former union member, dropped out of the organization in 1967 because of the disruptive child row and later became something of a spokesman for the school's 20 anti-UFT teachers who broke into the building to conduct classes for a handful of students during the 1968 strike. King's associate in the Black Studies program was Robert Lubetsky, a white 25-year-old disciple of the New Left who identified strongly with the militant wing of the Black movement. If Leslie Campbell supplied the emotionalism for the Black nationalist philosophy in the back rooms of the Afro-American Teachers Association headquarters, Lubetsky certainly provided the intellectualization and academic substance sustaining that point of view. On several occasions, Paul McSloy, acting chairman of the Social Studies Department, was obliged to order the teacher to remove provocative Black Panther posters he had displayed on the wall of room 248, the room used for the 3 Black Studies courses. There was always a question in the minds of most of his colleagues in the Social Studies Department as to whether or not the material was displayed for illustrative purposes consistent with good teaching technique. His critics contended that his course was primarily an indoctrination program, and that the teacher was using his classroom as a forum to express his own political views. It should be noted that these general feelings were never substantiated as fact and that no charges were ever brought against him. But the Black Studies program, controversial from its inception because of the instructors teaching in it and the students it attracted, became the focal point of events leading up to that riot of October 31st. By mid-October, for a variety of reasons, there was a noticeable shift in the wind. The goodwill and harmony that had characterized the opening weeks began to dissipate. The change was attributable, in part, to the overcrowded conditions which were being exacerbated each day. The school had returned to that multiple-session 10-period day, with students and teachers coming and going in shifts. Adding to the confusion after the semester began was the enrollment of 550 new students in September and 262 more in October. Some were new residents in the Lane zone. Some were transfers from non-zoned or private schools. But most of the new youngsters were dropouts from vocational schools who weren't making it there. Many of them were academically handicapped to start with, and many were discipline problems who had been encouraged to leave the trade schools. In November 1969, Mary Cohen did a survey to support her contention, made to Superintendent Jacob Zach, that the vocational schools regularly rid themselves of problem students by shifting them to the academic schools. Zach had asked Cohen for substantiation of this charge and she gave it to him, showing that in a random sampling of the transferees from vocational schools, 40% had been chronic truants. In spite of the evidence, Lane was back to where it had been the year before. Again bulging with 5,300 students, it was ripe for another explosion. All that was needed was the spark. That spark was provided by the militants. For the first month of the term they had been quiet, watching and waiting. But they weren't going to let the school recover from the shock treatment they had given it the term before. It was time for another dose. On October 22 they decided to do their thing, and their thing was to begin in room 248, where they took their Black Studies courses. It all started over a flag, and it was to escalate into uncontrollable mob rule on October 31, 9 days later. The black, green, and red flag had become the symbol of the Black nationalist movement with a tradition rooted in the Marcus Garvey crusade of the 1920s. For some time the militants and their core of followers had refused to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, which was part of the morning classroom exercise. The American flag, they argued, was not their flag, and they spouted all the slogans about the nation's hypocrisy and its persecution of the black man. But on October 22 they decided to do more than just reject the American flag. On this day they decided to replace that rag which hung in room 248 with their own flag of the black nation. Room 248 was their turf, they contended, and wasn't the whole course of study a result of their demands and especially designed for them? And hadn't they been practically hand-picked for it? Why shouldn't they be able to replace the U.S. flag with their own, the only flag that had any real meaning for black people? Surely, Lubetzky and King wouldn't object, they reasoned. The chickens were coming home to roost. What the militants didn't understand, however, and had no way of knowing, was Morton Celeb's sensitivity on the flag issue. While it was true that Celeb opposed the mandated morning Pledge of Allegiance exercise because it was so freely violated by both militant blacks and New Left white teachers, the flying of the colors was quite a different matter. He had tried dropping the pledge when the fall term began, and was quickly taken to task for it by the community association. It was re-established in the morning exercise without question. But the most important consideration was Celeb's remembrance of the April 16 sit-in in the school auditorium by the angry white community, a night he was vehemently berated and openly insulted by some of the demonstrators because there was no American flag in the auditorium.
What kind of school is this?
One woman had angrily asked.
Isn't this still the United States of America?
Another demanded. The absence of the flag and the animosity it generated was the topic of the next day's newspaper account. The purpose of the sit-in was lost in the discussion of loyalty and patriotism. It didn't matter to the crowd that it was common practice to keep the colors locked up in a casing in the lobby every evening. It was another strike against the principle. And it was with this experience clearly coming to mind that Morton Celeb injected himself directly into the flag incident in room 248, as irate faculty members registered complaints about the alien symbol that had replaced the stars and stripes in that controversial classroom. It was readily conceded that from an academic standpoint no one in the school, and probably very few in the entire system, was more qualified to teach African history in Swahili than Robert Lubetzky. A product of the city's public schools, he went on to graduate from Syracuse University in 1966, and in 1967 earned his master's degree in African history from the University of Manchester in England. He had imposing credentials when he began his teaching career in 1968 at the predominantly black and Puerto Rican Eastern District High School in Brooklyn. That first assignment was a disappointing experience which almost led him to give up on the city's public school system. He left Eastern District after one semester to take a position at Lane which he had secured from Celeb through a family connection. Lubetzky's career at Lane got off to a shaky start in 1968. Interpreting the UFT strike as an attack against the demonstration district in Ocean Hill and against the black community in general, he regarded the stoppage as incompatible with his own socio-political ideas. He joined the ranks of the non-striking teachers and for 10 weeks crossed the picket lines amid the jeers of striking colleagues whom he would later have to face inside. After the strike, Lubetzky, more than any of the 20 strikebreakers, was singled out for interminable scorn by the UFT teachers. He was ostracized by his own department and by most of the faculty. Little wonder that the UFT teachers should have blamed him for the flag incident which was to erupt into the riot a week later. The flag of black liberation was hoisted by the militants for the first time on the morning of October 21. While both King and Lubetzky, during the periods they used the room, discussed the propriety of the flag, neither made any attempt to have it removed. The discussion in the Black Studies classes centered on whether or not the flag should replace the stars and stripes. Most of the youngsters, according to Lubetzky, were willing to accept some form of compromise with the majority favoring the retention of the American flag. But the militants had other ideas. Comprising about a third of each of the three Black Studies groups, they were determined to win their point. The American flag had no place in room 248, they insisted, and the flag of the black nation must replace it. The lines were being drawn. What had begun as an internal class matter moved to the next stage of confrontation the following day. Lubetzky had been told by Assistant Principal Tadero that the American flag could not be removed. But the militants weren't to be denied, and throughout the day more black students were dragged into the encounter. At the beginning of each class period hordes of youngsters rushed up to room 248 and occupied it, preventing it from being used by the regularly scheduled classes. There would be no instruction in room 248 until the flag question was resolved, they decreed. By the end of the day the issue was a school-wide affair with curious students congregating around the room to get a glimpse at the intrigue that was unfolding there. 2 days of conflict, confined until then to a single room, had gone unsettled and no one seemed to have a solution to the impasse. Unfortunately, Celeb was at a meeting at board headquarters the day the incident began to escalate. The school day ended with a meeting between King, Lubetsky, Mary Cohen, and one of the leading provocateurs of the flag incident. The militant leader was appealed to by the educators, advised that this was not a battle worth fighting, and urged to drop the occupation of the classroom. But there was no turning back for the militants. By 9 a.m. the next day they had occupied room 248 again, more than 70 students crammed into a room that seats 42. The students of all three Black Studies sections had banded together, pulling in others of similar persuasion. This was to be the day of decision. How far could they go, and what would the principal do? They didn't have to wait long for their answer. While the militants were reoccupying room 248, Celeb was meeting with King, Lubetsky, Cohen, and Tadero to map their own strategy and decide how best to approach the tense situation. When word of the occupation reached them, Celeb decided to take a rather firm position compared to what his reaction had been in previous confrontations with militants. He rejected Lubetsky's proposal to allow both flags to fly side by side, and entered room 248, the gladiator walking into the lion's den. The mood was hostile. King and Lubetsky stood off to the side as the principal went before the group searching for a compromise they could buy. But the militants weren't looking for a solution. For them it was either total victory or confrontation. The more Celeb groped for a way out, the more intolerant the militants became of his involvement. The principal honestly believed that a compromise was possible and that if he could only hit upon a method of letting the militants back off and save face the matter could be settled. He was sadly mistaken. As the morning dragged on, the second-floor corridor became a pressure point. Word of the meeting with Celeb had spread throughout the school, and after the principal left to discuss the matter with aides, more black youths forced their way into the room during period changes. The police had been notified the previous day and there were countless plainclothesmen and uniformed officers in the immediate vicinity of room 248 and dispersed all over the school. After several hours of fruitless talk and suffering through verbal abuse hurled his way by the militants, the principal broke off the discussion and announced his final position: the American flag must be returned to its rightful place, and the Garvey flag could be hung anywhere else in the room as part of a display pertinent to the unit under study. Now he would leave the room and let them decide whether or not to accept the offer. It was rejected and they defied the principal's order to vacate the room. His patience tried beyond reason. Celeb went next door to the social studies office and began phoning the parents of the militant leaders. Their youngsters were under suspense, he told them, and the parents would have to come to school for the suspense hearing. It was the first time he had taken a forthright stand in dealing with political students. Even Ronald King, who had earlier appealed to them to accept a compromise, found his words falling on deaf ears. They had already rejected Lubetsky because they believed he was siding with Celeb against them. Now they were going all the way. There had been differences among them over where the flag should fly, but now they coalesced. Unwilling to accept an ultimatum, which to them was tantamount to defeat, they struck out, venting their hostility in destroying those objects in the classroom which were part of the oppressive system against which they were rebelling. Maps were torn off the wall and ripped to shreds, light bulbs were broken, a globe shattered. And as the frenzy moved toward a climax, the word was given and out into the halls they marched. All hell broke loose. Arm in columns 4 abreast, they paraded down the hall with the leaders up front holding the liberation flag high as they marched onward. Through the corridors they advanced, banging on classroom doors, exhorting students to leave their classes and join the demonstration. Their numbers grew, 80, 90, soon more than 100.
Power to the people.
They chanted in unison, and down the stairwell to the first floor. Meanwhile, word of the march had filtered down to the students' cafeteria. It never took much to start a disturbance there, it had been the scene of many, and in typical fashion tables and benches went flying, milk containers and trays of food splattering all over the large room, almost 1,000 students in the grips of hysteria. Those whites who hadn't already fled the building as the unbearable tension mounted through the morning now left immediately. They had learned from past experience that the cafeteria was the last place to be when the militants swung into action. By the time the first wave of demonstrators reached the first floor, their numbers had swelled to well over 100, and kept growing with each passing moment. The police were under orders not to interfere with them. The mood reached dimensions well out of control. Police, 30 to 40 of them, stood by helplessly. Their hands in the pockets, they watched in disbelief as the mob grew larger, and louder, and bolder. Teachers, fearful of their own safety, ducked into empty offices and classrooms, locking the doors behind them to get out of the path of the onrushing demonstrators. Chaos and anarchy was the order of the day. Disruption, intimidation, violence everywhere. The police looked on as frightened students ran past. The demonstrators continued their march, circling the first floor, past the principal's office and back again. Then up to the second floor they climbed, and finding room 248 locked, they headed for the nearest room big enough to seat the large following they had attracted. They broke the window of room 236, unlocked the door from the inside, and congregated to assess what they had done, to evaluate, and to plan their next move. When questioned about the charge that the police had failed to act in the face of lawlessness, William Cerrone, captain of the 75th Police Precinct, replied,
"The order of this command is that if there is any criminal activity and an officer sees it, he will make an arrest. Where it is a matter of internal discipline, it is a school problem."
The eyes of the faculty turned toward the principal. Angry teachers, unaware of the posture he had assumed in room 248, blamed him for giving in to the militants. How, they thought, could a handful of students be permitted to go this far, disrupting an entire school, endangering the health and safety of thousands of students? Someone had goofed, and that someone must have been the principal, most believed. Surely he could have been more decisive. In the past, incidents like this were immediately brought to the attention of the UFT chapter leadership, and the faculty had come to expect union action when the administration floundered. Jim Bauman and Edward Johnson, two social studies teachers in their mid-20s, had been elected co-chairman of the UFT chapter in June after I decided to step down to devote more time to my post as the union's District 19 representative. Although new and inexperienced in handling crisis situations, they quickly made their concerns known to Celeb and his assistants. The failure of the police to act was unconscionable and inexcusable. What steps would be taken, they inquired, to prevent a recurrence? The new chairman had the added task of establishing their credentials as faculty spokesman. Angry at Celeb, but cautious in their new role, they issued a memorandum calling for an emergency council meeting the next afternoon. In their statement to the press, the UFT chairman observed,
Some windows were broken by rocks and the demonstrators literally ignored the police and the principal. The teachers, many of them shaken and very much disturbed, will take appropriate action.
If mass confusion was the order of the day on October 23, the next day, a Friday, was even more chaotic. Literature had been prepared overnight by the Afro-American Students Association, the group with which Lane's militants were most closely tied. The flyers they distributed the next morning assailed Celeb for having insulted their flag, called attention to the pigs, and urged students to join with them in open defiance of the racist teachers and UFT. It was going to be another one of those days. The militant leaders who were not among the 5 suspended by Celeb were seen huddling in groups in the stairwells and congregating in the auditorium, the favorite gathering place from where they planned their moves on a period-to-period basis. Thursday's episode had been covered thoroughly by the media, and many parents, fearful for their children's safety, kept the youngsters home. Thus attendance was light, even for a Friday. But for the militants this was to be another day of confrontation, and the tactic was to march out of the building behind the nationalist flag after each period. All morning students entered and left. There was constant unexplained motion, but no effort was made to restrict the movement in and out of school. Cutting of classes was widespread and few subject sections had as many as a third of the total register present. Masses of students congregated in the student cafeteria as word spread that this was the place to blow first. In spite of the presence of 30 or 40 policemen in the building, and many more on standby outside, the riot erupted in the cafeteria on signal. A look of the eye, a nod, bang, it was on again. Tables and chairs flying about, an exact repetition of the previous day. Those whites who did come to school, and they were few, knew enough by this time to stay out of the cafeteria. They found refuge in departmental or administrative offices supervised by teachers. But even as the disruptors made their mad dash for the exits, there were at least 2 separate incidents of unprovoked attacks against whites fleeing the school. Fleeing was just the thing to do, for years of bitterness and seething frustration were coming to the surface. In the melee, 2 youngsters were arrested for inciting a riot. By 1 p.m. there was only a fraction of the student body left in the building. The UFT chapter council met briefly at the end of the day and decided to call for a meeting of the full chapter on Monday. The militants had proved their point again. They had the power and the know-how to put a stop to the entire educational process, and get away with it. There were a few more suspensions, like those of the day before, for the maximum 5-day period. The militants would be back soon, and were to be heard from again. The 1969 state legislature, in its haste to give students the right of due process, had guaranteed the right of the militants to destroy public education, a 5-day suspense, and they were right back at Lane. That was the law. During the winter and spring of the previous semester, John Lindsay had made numerous statements about the intolerable conditions in the high schools and how the city could not allow violence on the campuses. Amidst reports of continued racial flare-ups at Lane and at nearby John Adams High School in Ozone Park, the mayor spoke out again. But it was an old tune, a tired speech with time-worn clichés, the kind of talk the people had heard before. Anyway, it was an election year, and in 1969 the candidates were all supposed to be for law and order. The mayor warned the disruptors.
To the students of Franklin K., Lane and John Adams High Schools, I want to make very clear that we cannot and will not tolerate disorder. Differences can and must be settled peacefully.
In concluding his remarks, the mayor said he had called upon the Board of Education
to take all necessary action to maintain order in both schools and to report all developments to me immediately.
Conditions stabilized somewhat when the school opened on October 27, the beginning of a new week. The flag incidents, the demonstrations, the verbal barrage and intimidation to which they had been subjected during the week just past, filled the teachers with apprehension as they returned to see what the new week held in store. Over the weekend, Bauman and Johnson had drafted a proposed chapter resolution to press the need for relief and reform, and to place the school board on notice that the union chapter would not sit by much longer. It was a well-conceived and responsible document they offered to the UFT chapter at its October 27 meeting. But tempers were running high, and for the new chairman it was the first test of their leadership under fire. They were criticized from the right by militant teachers who found the proposals too mild and demanded, at least, the inclusion of a threat of a walkout. At the opposite pole there were the liberals who found the language dealing with the race question too strong and argued that it would be objectionable to the black community. George Altamari, the UFT high school vice president, had gotten deeply involved in the current crisis and argued strongly in behalf of the proposed resolution. It was designed as an initial statement to be built upon if the need for more drastic action was necessary at some future time, he cautioned. The resolution, amended in several places to meet the specific objections of different segments of the staff, was approved by a near-unanimous vote reflecting the general opinion of the faculty. The resolution stated the causes of the disruption in a 5-paragraph preamble, and went on to resolve.
1. That we reaffirm our commitment to provide the best possible education for every student at Lane High School, and 2. That we call upon the Board of Education in conjunction with the United Federation of Teachers to engage in a cooperative effort with labor, business, and civic groups to create a special task force for the purpose of converting Lane High School into an experimental comprehensive academic vocational technical institution, and for the city to announce its total commitment through the allocation of funds which will reverse the downward spiral and establish Lane as a model for educational excellence in the city of New York, and 3. that we call upon all those communities which presently send youngsters to Lane High School to join us in announcing their support for the principle of quality integrated education. And 4. That we call upon the student body to join us in rejecting all forms of racial extremism, and 5. That we call upon the school administration to deal promptly and directly with any teacher or student who through his actions in the school perpetrates violence, and that such person shall be afforded all rights of counsel and equal protection of the law consistent with the fundamental notions of due process, and be it finally resolved that the events of last week, however disturbing, shall not shake our unswerving faith in the future of public education on an integrated basis and our dedication to the concept of the brotherhood of man.
Copies of the chapter resolution were sent to the school board and to city officials. The union chapter was now on record with a positive and forward-looking position. They could not again be smeared as racists. The next day Bauman and Johnson sent a special delivery letter to the mayor, enclosing a copy of the resolution and asking that he commit himself, through the allocation of funds, and establish Lane as a model for educational excellence in the city. Little did they know that in just 72 hours Bauman would be sitting face to face with the mayor at an emergency meeting at Gracie Mansion. Now it was October 31st and Jim Bauman sped his car through the Queens Midtown Tunnel and into Manhattan, his destination the Central UFT headquarters on Park Avenue South and 21st Street. It was only 2 p.m., an hour that normally found teachers performing their classroom duties. But this hadn't been a normal school day at Franklin K. Lane. Already UFT Public Relations Director Dan Sanders had sent out a press release which was being carried over the local radio stations.
Albert Shanker, president of the United Federation of Teachers, demanded an immediate meeting today with Mayor Lindsay and the Board of Education to take steps to ensure the proper functioning of the city's high schools in light of the disorders at Franklin K. Lane High School. The teachers' union leader declared that
the safety and well-being of children in our schools must be the first order of business at this meeting.
Had Shanker gotten to Lindsay early or had the mayor reached the union chief first? It was only 4 days before the mayoralty election and Mario Procasino had already blasted away at the mayor for creating an atmosphere in the city conducive to violence and lawlessness in the schools. It fit right in with the Democratic candidate's major theme during the campaign. Only 5 months earlier, at a meeting of UFT High School chapter chairman, Albert Shanker had placed much of the blame for the school crisis on the mayor.
Obviously, the city set a kind of tone.
The union had declared
50% of the problem will be enhanced or cut back, depending on the mayoralty election. We can't put out the fire in one school at a time.
John Lindsay was being put on notice. He would have to deliver if he had any hopes of neutralizing the powerful teachers' union and its clever president. But that was 5 long months ago, and Shanker's implied threat of a sustained UFT campaign against the mayor's re-election bid never materialized. The enmity between the two protagonists in the Ocean Hill clash had been brought under reasonable control and both moved to close the communications gap. The mayor and the UFT president both recognized that to remain at odds would be self-defeating, laying to rest whatever personal aspirations each held for the future. Lindsay, rejected by his own Republican Party in the June primary, was running for re-election as an independent with the Liberal Party's endorsement. His only hope of winning was to recapture at least half of the city's Jewish vote, a vote that was expected to run as high as 35% of the total ballots cast. It was also a vote with which Shanker had immense influence through his own great personal prestige in the Jewish community. Of the system's 60,000 teachers, more than 2/3 were Jewish, and through their civic, religious, and fraternal organizations they could have been instrumental in mounting a mighty campaign against the mayor. How easy it could have been to remind New York's Jewry of the black antisemitism the mayor had unleashed against them by siding with the extremists of Ocean Hill. These wounds could have been reopened without too much trouble. And John Lindsay knew it. If ever a mayor needed a labor leader, John Lindsay needed Albert Shanker in 1969. For in the hands of the UFT president was the power to destroy the political career of a man many envisioned as a 1972 presidential candidate. After the strike, Lindsay moved steadily to establish his credibility with the union. The question of school decentralization was still up in the air. It had been at the core of the Ocean Hill dispute, and now the mayor would have to pay heavily for the suffering to which he had subjected the union. He began by trying to force the Dorgalamison School Board, appointed by him, to soften its own decentralization plan to meet specific objections of the union. Paradoxically, it was a plan the mayor himself had set in motion 2 years earlier by endorsing the Bundy Report, which recommended community control of the schools. But the price for community control was his own certain defeat in his re-election bid. It was a price the mayor refused to pay. At the very least, he would have to abandon his own radical ideas on decentralization. The power and prestige of the city administration would have to be taken out of the legislative battle about to be waged in Albany. It was. The Dorgalamison Board, abandoned by the mayor and with no broad base of support from a public it had alienated by its irresponsible actions during the 1968 school strike, was supported in the legislative halls by few of the major power blocks of New York. Lacking the confidence of the town's diverse and disgruntled populace, the school board had little punch behind its lobbying efforts for a far-reaching community control bill. The mayor's silence during the long and bitter debate could be interpreted in only one way. He and Shanker had finally begun talking the same language. The union came out well in Albany. The 11th-hour compromise bill it supported retained almost every point essential for the preservation of a centralized school system and, more important for Shanker, a centralized union local. All collective bargaining would still be done centrally, and there would be no separate negotiations with local school boards. The centralized board of examiners, the certification agency, would be retained, and there would still be central placement of teachers off lists from competitive examinations, a safeguard against pick-and-choose union-busting districts like Ocean Hill. The central school board would continue to operate, but it would comprise a representative of each borough to be appointed by the respective borough president, and later on to be elected by the registered voters in borough-wide elections. Note, when borough-wide elections for the school board were found to be in violation of the one-man, one-vote principle, the New York State Legislature twice extended the life of the interim central board rather than reopen the thorny question of decentralization versus community control of the schools. The mayor would then appoint 2 people of his own choosing to round out the 7-member central board. And the union would be able to use its newfound political muscle to influence the outcome of that election as well as those for the 31 community school boards. The next hurdle standing in the way of a Shanker-Lindsay alliance was the matter of a new union contract. The 1967 agreement was scheduled to expire in September 1969, a day before the start of the new school year. It had become traditional for negotiations to go down to the wire, and sometimes past it, but in 1969 it was to everyone's advantage to get an early and amicable settlement. Neither the city nor the union could afford another strike, or even the threat of one. The UFT was busy re-establishing old ties with parent and community groups and didn't dare jeopardize that #1 priority. Even more important was the fact that the UFT's rank and file was tired, very tired. For 2 consecutive years Shanker had led them into battle. 50 days of strike, the lost money, the heartaches, the antagonisms on the picket lines, divided faculties, and racial conflicts between white teachers and black communities had all taken their toll. Could he go to his people again? What issue could get them out on the street once more? Another stoppage was sure to result in internal union fratricide, and that above all else had to be avoided. There was only one issue between the union and the school board in the negotiations of June 1969, and that was money. This was a new board of education. The Dorgalamison outfit was put out of business by the new decentralization law, and its president, Joseph Montserrat, had already decided that there would be no further whittling away at administrative prerogatives and no more concessions to the union on non-budgetary items related to working conditions. The union, meanwhile, had gone through the motions, as it had done in every negotiating year since 1962, of having its executive board spend countless hours gleaning the thousands of demands submitted by dozens of different standing committees, subcommittees, functional chapters, and special interest groups operating under the umbrella of the 60,000-member local. But there was no bargaining of the laundry list this time around. Practically no negotiating was carried out at the subcommittee level. With everyone aiming for a June 27 settlement, almost all talks were conducted at the highest level. Even the UFT's first-line negotiating committee of 11 officers was dispensed with. Shanker replaced it with a bargaining team consisting of himself, Secretary Jules Kolodny, and Treasurer David Witz. Added to the select group were Shanker's closest aides, Special Assistant Sandra Feldman, Staff Director Deleonardis, and Dan Sanders, whom he had appointed coordinator of negotiations. This was the team responsible for putting a new pact together in June 1969, and with all parties anxious for a settlement before the end of the school year, Shanker came to his 51-member executive board to ask for a blank check in negotiations. Would the executive board accept whatever package he brought back in June, good or bad, rather than go to the brink again in September? He was given the answer he wanted. There would be no internal fight over ratification, as there had been in 1967, no matter what he came back with. In the end, they ratified the new 3-year contract after a verbal report from Shanker, without as much as a written outline of the settlement terms. The 1969 negotiations were carried on quickly and quietly. For the first time in 10 years there was no saber rattling around the table, no inflammatory press releases, no charges and countercharges about bad faith negotiating. Shanker and board president Montserrat had developed a friendly working relationship. It was the first time a UFT head was accepted by the school board as an equal at the bargaining table. All that stood between the union and the board this time around was money, money for a mammoth salary and pension package. The UFT negotiators were quite willing to give in on most of their demands regarding reduced class size, improved working conditions, policy voice at the local level, and school security to get a giant package in salary gains and pension improvements. And it was up to the mayor to provide the money. The 3-year contract, which was ratified on the very last school day in June, added the staggering sum of $1 billion, estimated, to the city's educational budget over the life of the agreement. It was certainly the most costly package ever negotiated with a public employee union. John Lindsay had made it all possible by giving the board authorization on money matters. He would worry about how to pay for it some other time. Now his primary concern was his re-election bid, and he wasn't going to let another teacher strike, or the threat of one, hang him up again. The early settlement was the cornerstone of the mayor's campaign strategy. The big knock against him had been his inability during most of his 4-year term to conduct fruitful negotiations with the city's large and powerful municipal employee unions. In addition to the 2 teachers' strikes, Lindsay had failed to avert stoppages by transit workers, sanitation employees, hospital workers, welfare department social workers, and job actions by the police and firemen's unions. It was an astonishingly bad labor record. No mayor in the city's history had been as ineffectual in the area of labor relations. John Lindsay came to City Hall by way of Congress on New Year's Day of 1966. Belying the liberal reputation he had established in Washington, the former Manhattan congressman brought with him a strong bias against New York's old-line labor leaders. Confronted with a transit strike, which outgoing Mayor Robert Wagner neatly dumped in his lap, during the first days of his administration, he went on television to denounce transit union president Michael Quill and the city's chief labor leaders as power brokers, making it perfectly clear that their days of influence in city government were over. He blamed the unions for much of the trouble the city was in. In Lindsay's patrician view, the unions were the oppressors of the blacks who were kept out of the high-paying construction jobs. And to the new mayor, the municipal employee unions were guilty of making the cost of local government prohibitive, and of forcing higher prices and higher taxes which chased businesses out of the city and middle-class whites to the suburbs. But most of all, it just wasn't Lindsay's style to wheel and deal in the back rooms. From his very first day in office, Lindsay refused to acknowledge the tremendous power of Harry Van Arsdale, head of the Central Labor Council, the giant citywide federation comprising 550 different local unions with an aggregate membership of 1.2 million employees in both the private and the public sectors. The mayor made the costly error of trying instead to use the media he commanded, relying on his own prestige and the power of his office, to go directly to the rank and file, bypassing the elected leadership of the locals. Tagged as a union buster, He found himself in one strike after another as union leaders became convinced that they couldn't get a fair shake from City Hall. Marked as the enemy of the working white middle class, scorned for his anti-labor tactics and for what was viewed as his selling out to the black extremists, and rejected by his own Republican Party in favor of conservative state Senator John Marchie from Staten Island in the June primary, the future could not have been bleaker for John Lindsay. How could he bridge the gap with organized labor and the middle class? And more important, how could he get the even split he needed in the Jewish community which boasted more than 1 million registered voters? For John Lindsay in 1969, Albert Shanker could be the great spoiler or the grand prize. If a détente could somehow be arranged with the powerful UFT, the mayor would be achieving a triple victory. First, it would provide concrete evidence that the school wars which had torn the city apart were finally over. Second, by negotiating a great teacher's contract he would be signaling the mighty labor federation of his willingness to discontinue his crusade to reform the city at the expense of the unionized white working class. And finally, a positive gesture from Shanker would at least give him a fighting chance to recapture the Jewish vote that was essential for victory. If there was any doubt about the UFT staying out of the mayoralty campaign, it was removed when Mario Procaccino, the only conservative in a five-man race, emerged the winner of the bitterly fought Democratic Party primary. Although the Central Labor Council, of which Shanker was a vice president, had endorsed its old friend Robert Wagner, who had served 3 terms as mayor before Lindsay, the UFT refrained from stating a preference. Bronx Congressman James Scheuer and author Norman Mailer, neither with the slightest chance of winning, both refused to bow out of the race. Bronx Borough President Herman Badillo, the first Puerto Rican to make a bid for the city's top post, saw his chances go down the drain as the party's liberal vote split 4 ways. Mario Procaccino was victorious with only 32% of the total 755,529 primary votes cast. Now he prevailed over a tattered and splintered party whose liberal wing refused to back the conservative nominee, and jumped instead to endorse the independent bid of John Lindsay, who was now free from the shackles of the Republican Party. The Democratic primary had immense significance for the UFT. Robert Wagner, a middle-of-the-roader, ran a disappointing second, 28,000 votes behind the winner and only 5,000 more than the fast-closing Badillo. Had Wagner won, the UFT president would have been hard-pressed to throw his union into the fray in support of the Democratic nominee. The former mayor had been a good friend of organized labor, a skillful politician, and a proven vote-getter with a broad base of support both within and outside of the party. Of all the Democratic hopefuls, he had by far the best chance to unseat the mayor. In a general election, Wagner was sure to get most of the anti-Lindsay votes as well as the lion's share of those garnered by the other 4 Democratic candidates in the primary. With a Wagner ticket, the Procaccino Democrats would have had little choice but to line up behind the former mayor, and the party's reform wing would not have felt compelled to defect, as they did, to support Lindsay. But in 1969 New York's Democrats were voting with their hearts, not with their minds. They chose a conservative who was to give the election away, over a moderate who couldn't have lost. The decentralization campaign in Albany had brought Shanker into an extremely close alliance with the city's Democratic regulars. He had especially high praise for Assembly Minority Leader Stanley Steingut of Brooklyn, whom he credited with shaping the compromise decentralization bill. In view of his growing ties with the party organization, it would have been difficult for Shanker not to call for a union endorsement of a promising Wagner candidacy. But the selection of Mario Procaccino as the party's standard-bearer made it easy for the UFT president to play it safe while paving the way for a Lindsay victory. The comptroller, a decent man, had been tagged with the racist label. His straight law and order campaign had driven an estimated 90% of the black vote from him. With that constituency convinced that Procaccino was too far right, there was never a chance of the UFT coming out for him. To have supported the Democratic nominee would have created the image in the black community of a conspiracy between the teachers and the most conservative elements in town. Such an endorsement would have done irreparable harm to the union's program of rebuilding its bridges in those communities, bridges it needed in order to survive, it believed. Complicating the union's position and strongly influencing it was the fact that the organization was about to undergo profound internal changes that would drastically alter its complexion. In 1967, the school board had introduced into the system a new employee category, that of paraprofessional. As a response to the criticism that only 6% of the staff was black, the new paraprofessional post was created to bring minority group parents into the schools as part-time salaried employees assisting teachers in classroom duties. By 1969 there were about 13,000 such employees in this job classification, practically all black and Puerto Rican, most being paid out of Federal Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Title I, funds and state urban education allocations to the school districts in designated poverty areas. Working from 2 to 4 hours a day, they held a variety of titles: educational assistant, family worker, teacher aide, and family assistant, to name a few. Bringing this new group of employees into the union fold was a major challenge for the UFT, one that became a top union priority in 1969. The union leadership, conscious of the fears of large numbers of grade school teachers, embarked on a major organizational policy change almost without the knowledge of the membership. In November 1967, Shanker quietly slipped a resolution through the Administrative Committee, ADCOM, and the Executive Board authorizing the union to begin organizing this new pedagogical group and to try to become the collective bargaining agent for it. By the spring of 1969, the UFT had committed its total resources to win a collective bargaining election against District Council 37 of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees for the right to represent these workers. For Shanker and the union leadership, this was understood as a life-or-death struggle. It was the one hope to build a base of power in the ghettos where local residents would identify with teachers and the union, and fight side by side with it for their own personal aggrandizement as well as for a better school system. It was to be the basis of the alliance Shanker had set as the first order of business for the UFT. The campaign itself was a hard-fought and dirty one, with the opposition charging that the UFT was out to exploit the helpless black parents. A defeat for the UFT was certain to mean years of intra-school feuding between the union's chapters and those of the insurgent paraprofessionals. Teachers were bound to see the new employees and their union as a challenge to themselves, infringing on UFT prerogatives. Few people understood the immense significance of this election, and while the attention of the general membership and the public was focused on the legislative scene in Albany where the school decentralization issue was being debated, and on the mayoralty primaries within both parties, a highly selective UFT leadership committee was pulling out all the stops to win an election to determine which union would represent this large block of school employees. With the UFT spending huge sums of money scrapping for the votes of black paraprofessionals, it would not endorse Mario Procaccino any more than it would squarely confront the racial crisis at Lane High School. Victor Gottbaum, executive director of the opposing union, had already given the mayor the District Council 37 endorsement. For the UFT to come out for Procaccino now would mean alienating untold numbers of paraprofessionals whose votes were so badly needed in this inter-union contest. The June collective bargaining election was indecisive, and it appeared as if the paraprofessionals would have to vote all over again in the fall. It was not until a week after the people of New York had given John Lindsay another 4-year lease on Gracie Mansion that the UFT was finally declared the official winner in the paraprofessional vote. In spite of the fact that an overwhelming majority of the union's 60,000 members were violently anti-Lindsay, Shanker embarked upon his own personal campaign to keep the union from coming out against the mayor. That he was able to nullify the tremendous antagonism teachers felt toward Lindsay is the most eloquent testimony to Albert Shanker's great leadership skills. He went to all the power bases of the organization, to the executive board and the delegate assembly, to the district representatives, to the chapter chairman, and even to the membership itself. Always his message was the same: the union can only hurt itself by supporting one of the 3 candidates, he told them. All 3 have done some good for the union, the story went. Procaccino, as the comptroller, had gotten our paychecks released to us when Galamison tried holding them back at a crucial point during the strike, and the Democratic nominee had taken a firm stand against adult agitators who were taking over schools by force. But how about John Marchi? The UFT leader would continue. The Republican candidate from Staten Island had been a great UFT supporter on school decentralization, and we owed him a debt for having steered that 1968 interim bill and giving us a year's breathing spell to marshal our forces for the final battle against community control. And then there was Lindsay. As much as we detest the actions he took during the strikes, isn't there evidence that he has learned his lesson? Shanker would ask. Just look at the great contract he gave us. And when the militants tried to take over a Bronx school this fall, didn't he step right in and come to the defense of the embattled principal and staff? But of course. This isn't the same John Lindsay, and now there was even an open line between the UFT and City Hall. But that alone would not have done the trick. Hatred of the mayor ran too deep. It was Shanker's ingenious play on teachers' fears that made him so convincing. It was the negative aspects of his argumentation that won the day. The union president went as far as to suggest that if we went against Marchie, who never stood a chance, the powerful state senator would be angry and could go back to Albany next January and sabotage the entire pension package we had just negotiated with the board but which was still subject to legislative approval. And as the pro-casino campaign turned into a fiasco, Shanker could argue about what a sad position we would be in if we supported the Democratic candidate and Lindsay was returned to office. Skillful, crafty, intimidating in his brilliance, he could convince the most hard-bitten Lindsay hater that the union should stay out of the campaign. They were all urged, instead, to go out and campaign as hard as they could for Marchie, or for pro-casino, or even for Lindsay, as some actually did. By having teachers working for all three candidates, Shanker reasoned, we would be for everyone and against no one. It was the best possible hedge, and we had to end up on the winning side. It was simple. It was direct. And it worked. Who could argue with the union president? Hadn't he himself been locked in mortal combat with the mayor and suffered more than anyone during those two disastrous strikes? And how could anyone challenge his judgment after the way he stood up and fought for teachers' rights in Ocean Hill and in Albany? If Shanker says stay out, he must know what he is talking about. There would be no UFT endorsement in 1969. Through Sally Bowles, the mayor's liaison on education affairs, an open wire was maintained between City Hall and Shanker's office as the first reports of the Lane riot came over the radio on October 31st, 4 days before the election. The conflict over the flag had ended on October 24th and conditions in room 248 were getting back to normal, on the surface at least. But the residue of resentment, among the militants especially, resulted in a week of unimaginable tension and disruption. When the bell rang ending each class period, large numbers of black students, 75 to 100 at least, made a mad dash into the school auditorium which was still being used as a study hall. Cutting their classes, they mingled with the general body of students assigned there. It had become a den of intrigue, and in spite of the presence of policemen in the large hall, no white student and few teachers dared enter the militants' lair. Open defiance of all forms of school authority and destruction of school property was the next phase of the confrontation that had begun in room 248 and expanded to a school-wide demonstration march the week before. But even as the UFT chapter was passing its forward-looking statement on October 27, the arsonists, the extortionists, and the terrorists had stepped up their level of activity. Attacks on whites resumed with a vengeance as conditions went from bad to worst. In one incident, a policeman apprehended a black girl who had been accused of stealing a pocketbook. A mob of boys immediately attacked him from the rear, forcing the officer to release her. The cry of police brutality resounded through the halls, and even the policemen felt their powerlessness. The presence of 40 to 50 police officers could not prevent a lesser number of militant students from doing precisely what they had set out to do, bring education at Lane to a grinding halt. The militants were in the thick of it, directing barrage after barrage, giving fiery speeches wherever large numbers of students congregated. But there were few attempts to remove them from the scene, only a limited number of 5-day suspensions, or to hold them accountable for the polarization they were creating. On Friday, October 31st, the leaders who had been suspended for 5 days for leading the rampage over the flag were returned to school. The decision had been made not to refer their cases to the high school superintendent, Jacob Zak, a move that would have kept them out of school pending an administrative decision by Livingston Street. The return of the leaders was a signal, and it climaxed a week of unbelievable terror. It started with a fight in the cafeteria between a white youth and a black one. The incident touched off several more racially motivated attacks of blacks against whites, many involving girls. The police finally moved in at Celeb's request to clear out the cafeteria, for the principal had decided to dismiss school shortly after noon. The school was falling apart. Students and teachers were running about, and there was panic everywhere as angry blacks were ushered out of the cafeteria and moved on to Dexter Court through the side entrances. Some proceeded to the Eldritch Lane elevated train station 100 yards down the street along Jamaica Avenue. But most just huddled together in groups, openly defying the police who were directing them away from the building. The scene elicited memories of radical leftists clashing with Chicago police at the Democratic Convention a year earlier. But the New York City Police Department had trained its officers well in the techniques of riot control. Disregarding the taunts of hot-headed youngsters who were being spurred on by the militants, the police kept their cool and with the most remarkable restraint guided the crowd slowly down the street toward Jamaica Avenue. Rocks and other objects had been hurled at them, but the police were not detracted from their primary goal of maintaining order. But suddenly, from the elevated train station high above Jamaica Avenue, came a flurry of stones, garbage, and other debris hurled down on the crowd below. Soon there was pandemonium. Students attacking police, the officers fighting back with nightsticks and fists. Then a wild breakout along the avenue and into Woodhaven. Turning over garbage cans and breaking windows along their route, bands of black youths held the neighborhood in a state of siege. At the train station the fighting continued. In the melee several black youths were hurled through the plate glass window of a supermarket. When it was all over 10 youths were arrested and a number of others reported injured. Students weren't the only casualties, 2 policemen suffered cuts and bruises. Few people realized how close the riot came to ending in a literal massacre. Roving bands of black youths had chased after white students in the streets of Woodhaven and Cypress Hills. Several of the whites, even before the riot erupted, had gone home to get their rifles. It wasn't until the next week that the staff learned of several shooting incidents in which white youths had fired over the heads of onrushing blacks, turning them around. Quickly a call was put through to the union president by the chapter leaders, describing the events which at the very moment were being witnessed by newspaper men and filmed by television camera crews who were standing by outside the school in expectation of some kind of explosion. That evening television viewers saw in their own homes the naked horrors of a race war in a school. The chapter message to Shanker was short. Bauman, Altamari, and I would be there in an hour. Something had to be done. Ed Johnson, Bauman's co-chairman, stayed behind to represent the union at a hastily called faculty conference, a conference which saw Celeb, drained by nervous exhaustion, faint at the microphone in the middle of an address to the staff. High school superintendent Jacob Zak, who had rushed to the school, tried to fill in for the stricken principal but received a shabby reception from an angry faculty. Bauman and Johnson had, in the meantime, agreed to announce a call for a job action unless there was movement by the administration to relieve the untenable situation. It was 1968 all over again. Students and teachers were paying dearly for the neglect of the school by the educational bureaucracy. Shanker had spent the better part of the afternoon on the phone with the mayor, Sally Bowles, Montserrat, and acting school superintendent Nathan Brown, elevated to the top post as a temporary replacement for Bernard Donovan, who had retired. In addition to sending out a press release calling for an immediate meeting with the mayor had simultaneously invited the board and the union to Gracie Mansion for an emergency conference. Shanker had scheduled a press conference at UFT headquarters for 4 p.m. He was making it look like the real thing. The Lane delegation met with the president for about 20 minutes immediately prior to the press conference. We couldn't keep going in this climate, we told him. Shanker had to take a hard line with the board and the mayor, we advised. The power of the union had to be brought to bear to get immediate and drastic changes for the school. Shanker was quiet and noncommittal. He had learned to be a good listener, especially when he had already made up his mind about what course to follow. When he felt he had enough information to respond to the reporter's questions, he rose from his desk and signaled Dan Sanders. He was ready for the press. We followed Shanker into the adjoining conference room where the camera crews and reporters were waiting. The UFT chief was very much at home with the news people and was a master at responding to the most double-edged question. His nimble mind and uncanny sense of timing guaranteed his success at a press interview. Accentuating the gravity of the situation, which had become the #1 news item of the day, Shanker announced the scheduled emergency meeting at Gracie Mansion for that evening, but declined to reveal what position the union would assume. After the press conference there appeared the first hint that the Lane crisis was about to be used to push some larger union aim. George Altamari and Dan Sanders engaged in a private discussion about how to take advantage of this opportunity to extract from the mayor a commitment for a special appropriation to hire security guards for all the city high schools. 80 black and Puerto Rican parapolicemen had been employed in several schools on an experimental basis. They were a welcome relief for teachers who could no longer control hostile black students. During the recent round of negotiations the union had demanded that a minimum of 8 security guards be placed in each of the 91 high schools. Even though this was a top high school demand it had died along with all the others that were barely introduced during the 1969 talks. But Vice President Altamari was a persistent fellow and he had learned over the years that there was more than one way to skin a cat. On October 9 he steered a resolution through the UFT High School Committee, over which he presided, stating
that the UFT insist upon security guards for all high schools. The High School Committee further urges that UFT officers meet with the highest officials of the Mayor's Office and the Board of Education, and that the UFT be consulted on the training program of the security guards.
Now Altamari and Sanders were planning to use the Lane riot as a lever to force an expansion of the security guard program. I listened as they hatched their plot and formulated their strategy. "You can't mean that you are going to use this meeting for something other than the Lane problem," I objected. "If there are going to be any deals made up there it's got to be in Lane's behalf," I insisted. Sanders and Altamari stepped back, assuring me that Lane wouldn't be sold short, but that they were in a good position to get the security guards for the whole division, as well. Naively, I accepted their assurances, but my worst fears were borne out by what took place at the Gracie Mansion conference that evening. The union bosses never blinked in their sellout of Lane High School. Little or nothing was accomplished for the school, while the citywide security guard program was to be more than doubled in only a few months. By March 1970, there were an additional 100 guards on the payroll. An outsider would never have known that a riot had taken place at Franklin K. Lane High School from the conversation in Albert Shanker's car on the drive uptown to the mayor's residence. The passengers, Altamari, Feldman, DeLeonardis, and UFT Welfare Fund Director Ray Lizza, talked about everything but the events at Lane in the meeting for which they were headed. As the 6th passenger, I was astounded by their seeming indifference and nonchalance. Their primary interest was in the mayoralty race and on that morning's straw poll which had left little doubt about the outcome of the election. The union leaders, all experienced and wise in the world of partisan politics, scorned the ineffectual campaign waged by Mario Procasino, and referring to the Democratic candidate, somebody observed,
"Mario would have found a way to lose even if he ran unopposed."
They all marveled at the slick professional campaign the mayor had conducted, admitting to his mistakes, such as the extended school strike, implying that he would not make them again, and stressing the positive aspects of his first term. He was, the Union chieftains were sure, on the verge of turning certain defeat into a stunning upset victory that would have far-reaching political implications not only in New York but across the nation. During the 30-minute drive, bucking traffic on 3rd Avenue during a busy Friday evening rush hour, not a word was spoken about possible strategy, tactics, and aims the Union would pursue. One had to wonder, even then, about the very purpose of the meeting which was the lead-off story on every radio and television news report that evening. Surely, if anything was ever to be attained to return Lane to the mainstream, this was the time for a commitment. The eyes of the entire city were on that majestic white structure on 88th Street where the town's #1 citizen resided. But even the radio in Albert Shanker's car was kept off, in complete disregard of what the newscasters were saying. Perhaps it didn't matter. Maybe it had all been decided in advance, with the union giving the mayor a chance to steal the spotlight and pro-casino's thunder and letting some of the law and order magic rub off on him. The gates to Gracie Mansion swung open and Shanker pulled his car up that familiar driveway just as he had done so many times in the past. The TV lights glared and microphones were jammed through the front window and up his face.
Mr. Shanker, is the union going to demand that Lane High School be closed down?
The newsman asked.
Is there a chance the UFT will call a strike?
The UFT president replied calmly, evading direct questions. A very terrible thing happened out there today and we're here because the mayor and the board and everybody else seems to be as concerned as we are about it, he told them. We want to find out just what they are willing to do to prevent it from happening again, and then he added the thought that the union had some of its own ideas about what should be done and that UFT proposals would be presented inside. It was all Shanker would say, and the city would have to wait to find out about the fate of Lane High School. Deputy Mayor Robert Sweet greeted the UFT delegation and directed it to a first-floor waiting room. The mayor was upstairs conferring with school officials and would be ready soon. Within a few minutes the rest of the union hierarchy arrived: Vice Presidents Sol Levine, Morris Shapiro, and Abe Levine, Associate Legislative Representative Reuben Mitchell, and Public Relations Director Sanders. Shanker left to confer with Sweet, the same Robert Sweet who had once told him,
I'll remind you to keep a civil tongue in your mouth while you are in the mayor's house.
But this was a different time, and on this night it was the UFT president who held all the trump cards. How hard would he push the mayor, Sweet wondered. Inside the waiting room there was a nervous air, for none of the union officials were quite sure why they were there. The only point of consensus was that on the eve of an election the politics of the situation was such that the mayor would be willing to make extraordinary concessions if he could come out smelling like roses. There was much chatter, no one being able to speak for 10 consecutive seconds without being interrupted by someone who disagreed or had a better idea to suggest. Still, no constructive direction relevant to the specific needs of Lane. Shanker returned from his conversation with Sweet and advised that we play it by ear. Let's first find out what the mayor and the board have in mind before we put any of our ideas on the table, he counseled. It seemed an appropriate strategy, for openers. Sweet came back a few minutes later to announce that the mayor was ready to begin the meeting. Up the winding flight of stairs the delegation moved, and into the large conference room which had been the scene of bitter feuds in the past. But on this night Albert Shanker stood in the doorway alongside John Lindsay and introduced the mayor to each member of the UFT delegation as they passed through. Lindsay's handshake was firm and friendly. Smiling, he extended his greetings.
Glad to meet you.
Or,
thank you for coming.
And to those he recognized from past ordeals.
Nice to see you again.
The mayor presided at the head of a large conference table. Already seated to his right were the city's top school officials: Board of Education President Joseph Montserrat, Manhattan's board member Isaiah Robinson, Board Secretary Harry Siegel, High School Superintendent Jacob Zack, and the President of the 4,000-member School Supervisors Association, Walter Degnan. At the opposite end of the table, across from the mayor, sat Acting School Superintendent Nathan Brown, now flanked on either side by Shanker and Altamari. The rest of the union delegation took their places on the other side of the table. Then came various police department officials and aides of the mayor. Sweet and Sally Bowles moved throughout the room, conferring intermittently with various participants. The tone of the meeting was solemn, but its purpose was soon clearly defined by the mayor. His opening remarks left no doubt that this was an assemblage of the family, called together to insulate the mayor and protect him from a possible political setback resulting from the Lane riot. What happened out there was terrible and intolerable, he told the conclave, and he went on to announce how one of his political opponents had already injected it into the campaign. That morning's Daily News straw poll had shown him 18 percentage points ahead of Procasino, and Shanker, always the master of the timely quip, interjected.
You mean you still have political opponents?
It broke the ice. Everybody laughed, including Lindsay. But he wasn't taking any chances on the polls. He was extremely annoyed that the radio stations had been giving the Lane riot what he called the drip-drop treatment, something coming over every 5 minutes as if nothing else had happened in town all day. After announcing that Police Commissioner Howard Leary was unable to attend because of a pressing commitment elsewhere, he turned to Deputy Commissioner John Walsh and asked for a police report. The official police version was a fantasy, grossly understating what had actually taken place and conflicting with the films which had been shown on the evening news programs. It omitted, too, the horrors that teachers and policemen had witnessed inside the school. Altomari quickly challenged the accuracy of the police report, giving his own version of what happened. Lindsay squirmed in his chair. How would it look for the Union to make liars out of his own police chiefs? Walsh backtracked, explaining that his report was merely a hasty condensation of all the information that had been channeled up from the precinct and divisional levels. If there were omissions or discrepancies, he would surely check it out before the night was over. Jim Bauman leaned over toward me and whispered,
Harold, I smell a rat. They're going for a whitewash.
The Lane chairman rose from his seat.
Mr. Mayor.
He began.
Who is that?
Montserrat wanted to know. The board president was making his presence known. He wasn't about to let the mayor usurp prerogatives that were his, and he was making it clear that he, not the mayor, was running the school system. Shanker identified Jim Bauman as the school's chapter chairman. 25 years old and new to his leadership role, Bauman was the only person in the room who had as his primary concern the safety of Lane's students and teachers and the viability of the school. Bauman was not their kind, and they all knew it as he described in an honest and forthright manner the gory details of what he had seen that day, pools of blood spilled on the stairs, and going into the office of the girls' dean and seeing 6 or 7 white girls crying hysterically, their hair disheveled and blouses ripped, several with blood streaming down their faces. Now everyone was feeling less comfortable, especially the mayor. If this kind of talk ever got out to the newsmen upstairs, the whole purpose of the meeting would blow up in the mayor's face. Shanker sensed the uneasiness and quickly came to Lindsay's rescue. Everyone is upset about what happened, he counseled, but it doesn't do any good to dwell on the past. Let's talk about the future and see what can be done to make sure it doesn't happen again, he suggested. The union president had changed the line of discussion, taking the mayor off the hook momentarily and passing the ball to the school officials who had yet to be heard from. Somebody suggested that the school be temporarily closed for a cooling-off period, but Montserrat left no doubt where he stood on the question of closing schools. He would have none of it. The board president was completely opposed to closing a school in the face of student violence, explaining that such action was tantamount to capitulation and would be interpreted by the disruptors as a signal of their victory. It would also lead to the spread of violence to other schools. No, Lane must stay open, he ordered. Closing the school was one of the points the chapter had recommended to Shanker, but it was apparent that the solution had to be found elsewhere. Attention shifted from Lane to the general citywide high school picture as Altomari steered the discussion to the need for an immediate expansion of the security guard program. He was looking for a commitment from the mayor to allocate funds earmarked for the security guard program. Shanker let the high school vice president play his cards, and Altomari came on strong, pushing for the expansion. Montserrat indicated he would be willing to expand the program if he had the funds but that he wouldn't cut back on some other program to do it. Lindsay allowed the discussion to meander around the security guard idea for a while, but soon he grew impatient. There were newsmen out there and a city was waiting. What about Lane? After all, he had assembled the top union and school officials to help him out of a political jam, and he wasn't going to get hung up on a budgetary matter. Returning to the Lane issue, Nathan Brown caught the mayor off guard by suggesting that the police be removed from the school.
Nat, you can't mean for us to take the police out after what happened there today.
The mayor responded, surprised by Brown's suggestion. The acting superintendent of schools hadn't been thinking of the political implications to which the mayor was most sensitive at this particular juncture. Brown, feeling a bit foolish over his faux pas, backed off and reshuffled his thoughts. Nathan Brown had two immediate concerns. First, he was out for the newly created post of chancellor, the top administrative job in the new decentralized setup. He announced his resignation from the school system 3 months later when he became convinced he would not be awarded the top post by the school board. At the same time, the acting superintendent felt a direct responsibility for the renewed violence at Lane. Earlier in the meeting I had risen to direct my remarks toward the failure to learn from last year's violence, revealing how Brown himself had rejected our plea for a breathing spell and had, in fact, ordered the school's return to a multiple-session 10-period day from the single session under which it had operated in the spring of 1969. "If only you had listened to us last spring," I said, "and kept the incoming class down to a reasonable number, we could have stayed on a single session and begun addressing ourselves to some of the problems. We predicted this would happen again unless the school was given significant and speedy relief. Now it was all out in the open." Brown's face reddened, a sneer came to his lips, and in striking back his gut feelings came through. Lane's problems, the superintendent countered, stem from an ultra-conservative white community and a quasi-political neighborhood group which is not comprised of parents of Lane's students. "These people don't want black kids in the school," he argued, "and they are constantly stirring up trouble." Brown, in defending himself, was also making points with Montserrat, a Puerto Rican, and Robinson, a Negro, telling them exactly what they wanted to hear, playing on their own prejudices and political leanings. The mayor didn't have to be told about the politicos of Cypress Hills. He was all too familiar with them. He knew it was the spawning ground of Vito Batista, the local assemblyman who earlier in the year had been a declared candidate opposing Lindsay in the Republican primary. To avoid splitting the conservative vote, Batista finally stepped aside, taking the comptroller spot on the Marchie slate and paving the way for the Staten Islander to defeat Lindsay in the primary. And the very beginnings of that defeat were conceived in Cypress Hills when Joe Galliani converted his 38th Assembly District Independent Club into a Dump Lindsay headquarters, a movement that caught on in Republican circles and ended up with the mayor being denied his own party's support in the general election. John Lindsay, like Nathan Brown, had nothing but contempt for Cypress Hills, and there was no reason to expect that he would come rushing to its assistance. Morton Celeb made his entrance about 30 minutes after the meeting had started. Neither Brown nor Zach had invited him to participate in the conference. Celeb had learned about the emergency session from a radio broadcast and, angered at what he considered to be an inexcusable slight, decided to attend on his own volition. He took a seat next to Walter Degnan, and when it was his turn to speak, his opening comment was,
"I don't often agree with Harold Saltzman, but in this instance."
Brown was livid. It was absolutely unheard of for a principal to hold his superiors up to criticism, but Celeb had decided that he was not going to be the scapegoat. He knew too much, and they weren't going to throw him onto the scrap heap as they had done to so many other principals when it was expedient. There already was an impressive list of principals who had been kicked upstairs, talked into early retirement, or granted emergency sick leave with pay when public attention was directed as difficulties in their schools. Celeb was still a probationary principal with another year to serve before the decision about his tenure was made. The blacks as well as the whites had been screaming for his head since the January burning incident, but he wasn't about to let himself get dumped without a fight. He made that perfectly clear by his uninvited presence that evening. Celeb wasn't going to be anybody's fall guy. The first hour passed rather quickly. The mayor, while agreeing that the board had the authority to set school policy, intimated that if he was asked for special funds for a security guard program, such a request would be given immediate attention. But, he emphasized, that request had to come from the board, not the union. Now it was up to Montserrat. A simple request appeared to be all that was standing in the way of a happy ending for Lindsay. But the board president surprised everyone by getting perturbed about what he considered to be a negotiating session. "That's not what he had come here for," he announced, rather annoyed at the course the meeting had taken. He would not discuss the matter further. If Shanker wanted to come to his office on Monday to talk about school security, fine, but not here. Montserrat surprised the other participants with his emphasis on protocol. Now there was an impasse and Robert Sweet, recognizing the problem, suggested a short recess during which the groups could caucus. Nobody was quite sure about what was going on across the table, or under it, except that the mayor's plan of walking out of there arm in arm with the union and board presidents was not working out quite the way he had hoped. The UFT delegation returned to its waiting room and caucused. Shanker, who had spoken very little at the conference, now took full command of the union forces, which up to then had been freewheeling and somewhat undisciplined at the table. He felt the union was getting nowhere by pressuring Montserrat, a proud man, in the mayor's presence. The board president, Shanker observed, didn't want to negotiate in front of the whole world. Also, there was no point, he felt, in trying to hold a gun to Lindsay's head, because even if we threatened to knock him publicly it wouldn't have any effect on the outcome of the election. He was a winner and we would have to deal with him for another 4 years. But the tip-off on the Lane sellout came from Sandra Feldman, Shanker's right arm, who had swallowed Nat Brown's story hook, line, and sinker, and was telling Shanker.
Al, those kids
The blacks
have a right to go to that school.
Lindsay and Montserrat were caucusing too, Shanker reminded his subordinates, and suggested that they were getting their signal straight behind the scenes. Soon Robert Sweet came down and called Shanker out into the corridor, bringing word of the goings-on upstairs. Shanker returned moments later with the news. Montserrat was in accord with the union security guard proposals and he would meet with Shanker the following week to work out the details and to take a closer look at the Lane problem. In the meantime the school would reopen on Monday under heavy police guard and high school superintendent Zach would be at the school to meet with Celeb and the chapter representatives to make changes and provide for the tightest security. But there was no indication as to what changes the board would consider, nor was there any commitment from anyone about a specific program of reforming the school, as had been proposed by the Lane chapter on October 27. Nobody in the UFT delegation questioned the terms of the verbal understanding. The other union officials had only come along as window dressing. Shanker had upped his credit rating with City Hall and Altamari had gotten his security guards for the high schools. Instead of standing up to object to what was clearly a sellout of the Lane chapter, I, like the rest, went along. And Jim Bauman, in way over his head with the union bigwigs, didn't want to be the lone unpopular voice. The chance to save Lane had slipped through our fingers. When the conference was reconvened upstairs, all the creases had been ironed out. Lindsay, Montserrat, and Shanker all reiterated what had been agreed to through Sweet, and in 5 minutes it was over. Now all that remained was for them to go up to the press room and announce their unanimity about the solutions to Lane's problems. Each in turn appeared before the television cameras and gave substantially the same speech, emphasizing their unity and cooperative spirit. Now all John Lindsay had to do was keep enough police at the school for a single day, November 3rd, and he would be returned to office for a second term. For the parents, students, and teachers of Franklin K. Lane, the future was hardly as bright.